Africa is a home to a growing number of startups, but many of them also face significant challenges in their quest for growth and success, which also makes me ask the question, is Africa becoming a startup graveyard? In this micro-documentary video, we will be exploring some of the most pressing issues facing African startups today. And I am also going to be highlighting some of the solutions and initiatives aimed at supporting them. Number 1, access to funding. According to a report by Patek Partners, funding for African startups is expected to drop to 3 billion by the end of 2023, marking a significant decline from the 4.5 billion raised in 2022. This shortfall raises concern about the state of the African ecosystem. The lack of VCs and also angel investors. You see, one of the funny things about the African startup ecosystem is the fact that Africa has a lot of billionaires. Africa has a lot of people who has been able to make it to the top. But one thing that is also significant with the African business ecosystem is the fact that those that have been able to make it to the top usually don't build a system that the younger ones can climb through. This is killing the African startup ecosystem in a way that the younger ones sees people that are motivations to them but does not know how these people got their wealth. This can also be proven by doing a quick Google search on YouTube about how to become rich. There are tendency that 99% of the videos that are going to be shown to you are made by the Western wealth ecosystem. The African wealth ecosystem does not have a system or a ladder or a blueprint of wealth that people can climb through. This leaves a serious loophole for most of the new startup founders because they don't know how to navigate the African business ecosystem, even though they have access to the funds. Number 2, regulatory barriers. In 2021, the Nigerian Central Bank in 2021 banned banks and financial institutions from dealing in or facilitating transactions in digital currencies like crypto and forex. Also, from my research, I found out that even though more expensive, it is much more easier to register a new company outside the shores of Africa while you are in Africa than it is to register a startup company in Africa. Another issue that might be raging so much as startups is the fact that a lot of startups pay taxes, but the government does not do anything to compensate for these taxes. Most of the startups provide electricity for themselves, provide data for themselves, provide good internet network for themselves, and every other amenities that might be needed. In Africa, it is easier for a camel to go through the hole of a needle than a startup to get a funding from the government or the authorities. Leadership pride. While the government and the authorities are being blamed, we cannot also overlook the fact that most of the African startups have issues with direct leadership, which means most of the owners of the startups in Africa does not submit to the business structure of how a startup is to be run. A typical example is a payment solution called Payday, where the founder takes decision without even the core members of the startups knowing about it, thereby making them lose their credibility and also lose some of their critical members. Payday was later on placed on for sale, but nobody was interested in buying it because the organizational structure was not there from beginning. Shady Moves. This is particularly popular amongst the African fintech startups, whereby some of the founders engage in unethical practices such as fraud when dealing with its customers. A lot of the African fintech startups has one or the other allegation stacked against them, ranging from Flutterwave to Payday. This is all because there are a lot of shady moves going on in the system. And this is synonymous with almost all African financial institutions, but it is more popular among the startups because the regulatory bodies does not pay much attention to them. Poor customer service. Most businesses and startups in Africa does not really value their customers. Most of them are money oriented and what they want are profits. And this is one of the things that kills a startup easily. An example is picking 5 random startups in Africa and try to chat with their customer support. It might take them over 24 hours to be able to reply to you, and it might take them over a week to reply to your comments on their social media platforms, unless you tag them on celebrity posts, which now make most Africans resort to tagging most of these companies to celebrity posts. Idea duplication. Most of the startups that are growing in Africa are a mimic of ideas from the Western world, whereby most of them has not really carried out a market survey of how the African audience are going to accept this new idea. Most of them go ahead, they launch this idea, and it does not take off. Why? Because the Western ecosystem is different from the African ecosystem, which means the business strategy that works in the US might not work in any of the African countries. And most of the times, they go ahead to launch without consulting experts in the field they are about to venture into. This usually leads to the fatal failure of most of the African startups. The last but not the least of the problem, which is also the biggest we are facing as startups in Africa, is the fact that the African ecosystem does not support growth. The lack of infrastructure, regulatory barriers, and limited access to funding can make it difficult for a startup to grow. This also points us to the fact that for a startup to grow in Africa, it is almost like the only selected few are allowed to grow, which means if you don't know anybody in the government or in any of the high places, there are tendency that you might never have access to funding from external sources that will push you out there, including funding from VCs that are not in Africa. All this combining together are what makes most of the VCs and most of the investors take a pause on how they invest in African startups, because at the end of the day, most of them lose their money. This triggers a lot of bad notes to investors across the world. Now, what could be the solution to this? The major solution that can help an average startup grow in Africa is when the leaders, the politicians, and the government can come together and make laws that makes the environment conducive for an average young person to be able to build an idea and turn it into profit, and also create structures that help teach young people on how to build a system that can grow into profits. All this while providing the basic amenities like access to electricity, access to good internet connections, and also ensuring that the network providers makes at least the internet data cheap for an average young person to be able to afford. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Let this go viral so that the government can hear our voice once and for all.